Boom, 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 boom. Master of none, jack of all trades, master of none. See what they did there with the title? Right. What's up, TVAC? Oh, that's great. Don't do that. I got a lot of notes on Master of None, so I'll try to get through them swiftly and go through your. I went through your comments. It's just a thing I do. Um, yeah, we had a good discussion on Monday about it. Um, and there's just so much going on. Um, but just to back up a little bit, I think this is Aziz Ansari's sort of masterpiece, right? He's a good comedian. Loved him on Parks and Rec, but this sort of shows this growth or evolution of an artist really well. Um, his stand up can be kind of inconsequential, maybe is the word. Funny, but not really powerful. Um, so this show just seems like it's this manifestation of, you know, frustrations and concerns and insights that Aziz has had within his community and show business and things like that. Um, and from a representation standpoint, you know, it's you know it's good to have uh, to have more people of color represented, and not just in a stereotypical way, as we'll get to. Um, my This show is Aziz taking his fame and doing something with it. If that frames it any better for you, for what I'm talking about. Like, he's pretty famous, and to do a show like this, he kind of puts himself out on a limb a little bit. Less so than if he had done it like 20 years ago or something, but still, I think that it's noble, or nobler than most things on TV from that perspective. Um, I like that the show is about brown people for the most part, and it doesn't reduce race to a black white dynamic, right? When we talk about race, especially in this country, our minds and our sort of instincts immediately go to black white, right? That's how we've distilled the discussion of race in this country for the most part. When it's certainly more diverse and layered and nuanced than that, right? And this show, I think, really puts that at the forefront, right? Um, with his two best friends are a gay black woman. There's three minorities and an Asian guy. So, like, right there is this little um, just it's diverse there, and we have several Indian characters, and his agent is a black woman. So representation is, A, I think, more accurate or authentic, but B, diverse. Um, and I think in the good ways, which we'll get to. Um, so it offers a different perspective on race, um, and just Asian identity in general. And I'll say this. I said this in class. Like, it's hard. My whole life, I've been watching TV and movies, and seeing me, you know, basically up on the screen, right? I'm always seeing white people talking to white people about white shit, right? Like, you almost take it for granted. So I can't put myself in the shoes of somebody who isn't white and what they see, right? They don't see themselves. They don't see those interactions or um, their communities represented. So that this show exists, among others, over the years, like how much that means to people and communities, marginalized communities. I can't I can't quantify it, um, but I have to assume it's pretty powerful. Um, so there, and as I mentioned before, like all these, it's an intersectional show is what they would call it. Now they probably weren't even calling it that when it came out, but this idea of intersectionality that has um, sort of evolved over the last 5 to 10 years. Um, how all these things intertwine, intersect, for lack of a to be that guy. Um, right. So black, gay, like race, sexuality, gender, politics, economic. How do all of these things overlap and intersect? And the impact of those intersections and things like that is it's kind of a buzzword now in our discourse, and Master of None was kind of out in front of that a little bit. Um, Probably not even on purpose. Uh, so that um, the this show doesn't take the typical racial cheap shots that you're used to seeing, right? In fact, it discusses those cheap shots. Like this episode, in particular, is a little weighted, right, towards these things that I want to talk about for class. But use the use of white actors and their accents, and just the stereotyping of Indians um, is interesting, and but it doesn't take those cheap shots and do the cheap jokes. Like I think a show like Blackish, at least when it started, had a lot of that humor in it, and I was like, it just leaves a bad taste in your mouth. You're like, come on, you don't. We're better than this, right? And I think they grew out of that. I remember I watching the pilot. I was just like, ugh. It's a bunch of like grape soda. I mean, just bad stuff, like cheap shots, basically. This show doesn't seem to take those cheap shots, um, which is good. Uh, um, race isn't just black white. What does it do? Yeah, this just works differently than other sitcoms. You know, um, it doesn't reduce race to just black white. Um, the Asian struggle is way down the line in terms of our representation of it in the media, for sure. And this is sort of, trying to move it up a few notches and just to be heard, right? Giving voices to these communities is important. Um, Gives voice to races that are experiencing this crisis of identity and values. Like, right, that's Dev in this episode. Is just like, he's torn between, you know, what he believes in, what he thinks is right and wrong, making money, working, like all these things are sort of pulling him in different directions. But I liked that in this episode, he's we're seeing the process, right, of him making these decisions and the impact, like the implications of his decisions and things like that. Right? He talks to Busta Rhymes. He does the thing with Danvers. He talks to Ravi. He talks to his friends. Like this whole thing is showing how, again, if to use my stupid sausage metaphor from Girls, right? Girls is showing how the sausage, the feminist sausage, is made, and the implications of our morals and beliefs and decisions and how those impact our lives. Whereas like Sex and the City, they don't concern themselves with the work that goes into fucking and shopping. We're just in this utopia. Like we just got there. Yay! Snap your fingers. Everybody wins. That's kind of it's kind of doing that with race in Master of None. We're seeing like how it all works and how it's navigated by marginalized groups and how they, you know, kind of work through all this bullshit before the sausage is made, as it were. I kept coming back to this in terms of that. I was just talking about this little catchphrase, basically. It's an exploration of race, not an exploitation. Right? That kind of crystallizes the whole thing. Is exploring the complications and the complexities and the nuance of racism, just race in general, not exploiting it for laughs and cheap jokes, right, and to make money, as it were. That's a good one to sort of put in the back of your head, right? Are we exploring this or are we exploiting this? Like whatever it is, especially in the media, because 9 times out of 10, it's exploiting. But it doesn't take those, like it's back to taking the cheap shots. It's not taking those cheap shots. I mentioned in class, and nobody knew what the Bechdel test was. I'm like, come on, guys. Anyway, I said, this is the Bechdel test for race. And the Bechdel test, for those of you who don't know, is it was created to just sort of gauge or chart female positive media content, I guess. And you basically take note of how much time is spent on a TV show or in a movie with 2 or more women talking to each other about something other than men. So if you pass the Bechdel test, you have X number of scenes or screen time where it's just women talking to each other about something other than men. So I called Master of None the Bechdel test passes. It's the Bechdel test for race, where there's, the white people in this show are, there aren't many. So almost every scene is multiple races talking to each other about something other than, white people or whatever the equivalent might be there. And that's a good thing for sure. Yeah, there's no shortage of white guys talking to white guys about white things, right? So representation is very meaningful for the show. And it's not, we got into this discussion too a little bit on Monday. It's not tokenism. It's not, oh, look, we have all, we're all represented here, but they're these shallow stereotypes. That's not what it is. There's depth to, I think the show tries to give depth to all those, the principal characters at least, like Dev and his friends, and I think it does a good job of doing that. So it's not this tokenism that we're talking about. And the difference, some of you mentioned it, right? The difference between like representation and tokenism and diversity and just being diverse for diversity's sake, which is almost counterproductive. And like, but that's something that certainly we went through in the 90s and the early 2000s was that idea of like, oh, just, let's just have a diverse cast, but just make them horrible stereotypes, right? Not give them any depth. I got so many things to say about this. Doesn't condemn Dev for taking the job, shows the process of how he got there. Does that make sense? And the way it deals with race is interesting, because this is about the exploration versus exploitation. Like a typical sitcom would have taken, like, what are the racist sort of acts in this episode that drive the entire plot of the show. It's the woman who asks Dev to do the accent at the beginning, right? She's the racist, and Danvers' joke. Like, those are the two things. Now, in a typical sitcom, it would sort of point those out and be like, those are the racists. It's bad to be racist. And at the end, they'd all be in a room and they'd be like, hey guys, racism's bad. Like, don't be racist. And then some fucking catchphrase and a joke, and the laugh track would go off and they'd fade out, right? This doesn't do that. This explores. It doesn't focus on that. It's like, how do Dev and the other characters react to that racism and negotiate it and try to get to, a logical and productive end. And I think that's important. It shows, again, the sausage being made thing. I think it's interesting to note as well that Aziz has had success, media success, career success with his race being incidental, right? His being brown has no bearing on his stand-up, right? He doesn't do a ton of like Indian jokes or whatever. He doesn't do that. He's just a dude with brown skin doing stand-up. Tom Haverford is probably his most famous character from Parks and Rec. His race is incidental. He just happens to be brown. There's very little focus on it or stereotyping or anything like that. So, like, he at least has this sort of track record in real life of, shedding the sort of racial racial coverings that a lot of times can plague characters of color. So that's interesting. But it's about a minority experience. It gives depth to the conflict within every person of color. So, like, yeah, he's torn. Like, if Ravi, who is oblivious to everything for the most part, right, and Dev's kind of educating him as they go along. But it's about, again, about experiencing this, exploring these issues and dynamics and conflicts and struggles that, you know, people of color, marginalized communities have to face every day. An example, if you want to compare it to, and we did this on Monday, like Raj from Big Bang Theory is a perfect example of a stereotypical Indian character. He is there to be Indian, right? And do the accent and do all the jokes and use everything like that. You don't see that in Master of None because there that's exploitation, and Master of None is exploration. You see what I'm saying? You see the difference there? I think that's a good way to sort of frame it. Hey guys, racism is bad. We know that. The show also doesn't want your pity or sympathy. It's not. This episode wasn't the same as all the others in that it's not like a very special Master of None where he experiences racism. That's again exploration versus exploitation. Doesn't want your pity or sympathy. Um, it it wants you to it wants to get everyone a better understanding of this minority plight, right? And I think it does a pretty good job of that. The plight of minority communities is at the forefront. And again, how much of myself do I have to give up today? Again, a question you should never have to ask yourself, but here we are. What? Yeah. So there's a lot. It's a great series too. I think this episode is real specific, but I think every episode deals with this kind of stuff. You know, explores it to beat the exploration versus exploitation horse to death. I want you to remember that. And you know, your comments sort of point into this too. This kind of stuff. Well, we bring up this. Peter in class was talking about Never Have I Ever. So, Never Have I Ever is another Netflix show. They did one season. It debuted last year. And it is, I mean, talk about like an Indian show, right? It is. It's about a teenage American girl, right, with Indian heritage, and her mother's from India, and it's about Indian culture, but she's American, so she has all these American teenage issues, and her friends are an Asian girl and a black gay girl, and Mindy Kaling is connected. It's a whole thing where Peter was like, "Is this the same? Is this basically Master of None?" But it doesn't feel like an Indian show, right? The way they talk about it in Master of None, multiple Indian characters doesn't feel like an Indian show. Like that's one of those. That whole scene with Danvers and um, kind of it's pretty cringy, but I think there's a lot of truth to it. Like that's where a lot of TV execs are coming from. Like we're not ready for it, you know. America doesn't want that. If you have two Indian characters, it's an Indian show. That won't make money or sustain itself or whatever. Is bullshit. Like I'll get to that in a minute, but you should watch Never Have I Ever too. Tom brought up the whole buying out, like white rich people, basically throwing money at their issues, right? At their misdoing, and thinking that he takes Dev to the Knicks game and, shows him, gives him all this attention. Like, that'll make up for his being racist or ignorant or whatever. And I equate that to the idea of concessions, like we talked about with All in the Family and the civil rights movement and Boondocks. It was like, I think there is this need for those in power to be like, just give them something to shut them up, to pacify them, to distract them from, what I've done or what I'm doing to their community, and they'll be fine. And you see that sort of playing out in this episode. Um, it's something that you can only do from a position of privilege as well. So, sort of buying their way out, I equate that to the whole notion of, concessions that we sort of that we give to people in lieu of equality, right? Take this nice shiny thing and, just appreciate that you got that. It's very condescending. Krista, a spoken like a true Vaughn class alum, talking about the sacrifices that minorities have to make every single day, which is the same as my whole how much of myself do I have to give up, right? And which Krista and many of you have heard me say ad nauseum. Yeah, the sacrifices people of color have to make, like that's what this show is about. In this episode in particular, right? We see Dev waffling back and forth. Doesn't want to do the accent, so he turns down the part. That's very, principled of him. But then releasing the email, do I do it? Do I not? The implications of it, like the whole thing, it's unfortunate, but it's real. RB Dubs brought up token. I mentioned it earlier. The idea of tokenism and I think the term you used was non-progressive diversity, right? Diversity is supposed to be progressive, but just putting characters in for the sake of putting them in is kind of racist and regressive, right? It's not progressive at all. And that whole thing was represented near the end. Danvers dies, and this young female executive takes his place. And it's sort of that veiled racism when they say, we're not going to do the original idea. What we're going to do is this old idea, and we're going to instill, yes, which is Perfect Strangers. I don't know if you know what that is, but it's an old sitcom from the 90s with a guy and his cousin from Mypos moves in with him. So it's this fish out of water. He's a Middle Eastern stereotype. And how does this go? And crazy hijinks ensue. So they were going to do it, the Indian version. So Dev plays. I think Dev plays. Basically, it's moving backwards, right? He's going to play this horrible Indian stereotype, and they're going to sort of bounce it off of this Americanized Indian. So it's like it's a backwards move, but it's two. There can be two, right? It's two Indian characters, but it's like, no, that's not progress. That's That's moving backwards, and this push to be diverse just to be diverse um, is kind of, it was the way that Hollywood kind of dealt with the push for equality and representation. Was, all right, just give them shitty versions of themselves, which doesn't really help anybody. Um, and then a bunch of you mentioned the you know, there can be two status, which is an interesting way to look at it, right? That African Americans and gay people, there can be two of those characters and still have a successful show, but Indians aren't yet at the there can be two status. Um, yeah, a lot of you mentioned that in your comments and how kind of fucked up that is. Um, so Ina, I'll leave you guys with this. Ina's comment, which I liked, right, about sort of how success is often in conflict with our morals and values and how shitty that is. But it seems like many of us, not just people of color or marginalized communities or whatever, or in Hollywood or whatever, I think it's more prominent there. Your success often rides on, whether or not you can stay true to yourself. And that seems like a fucked up agreement that we have, right? You can either be successful or you can be a good person. Like that kind of seems how it breaks down more often than not, or too often, I guess. And Dev sort of plays with that in this episode, right? Um, releasing the email, and playing the race card versus charging it to the race card, as Buster Rhymes so eloquently puts it. Like when we should be able to just be ourselves and be successful, if that makes any sense. It seems counterintuitive to have to compromise one for the other. But I think most of us are put in those positions every single day. So I hope you guys liked Master of None. I'll give you an extra credit word here. Use the word powerful in your response to this post, and you will be rewarded handsomely upon the course conclusion. So, powerful, use the word powerful, and get bonuses.